So our agenda, we're going to provide an overview of component 1, an overview of the focus topic for tonight on selected response items, information on preparing for the selected response items. I know that the question we hear the most is, are there resources out there? Do you have suggestions on what I should study in preparation? So hang tight, we definitely have some recommendations coming that we've been collecting from folks who've taken component 1 across the certificate areas. We're going to talk a little bit about assessment logistics, talk a little bit about test anxiety strategies, and then a couple of additional resources. So let's start off with a grounding for component 1.
Sorry, unmuted myself. So I wanted to ground component 1 in something we are all so familiar with, which is the 5 core propositions. And in case you're unfamiliar with this, or this is the first component you're doing, this resource is available online as a PDF and as an interactive website. And that will be in the notes that come out to you. But core proposition 2 expects teachers to know the subjects they teach and how to teach them. And I love the way the proposition opens. And that is that if one cardinal principle of teaching is a commitment to the welfare and education of young people, another is a commitment to the subject matter. So we really have to be in command of that subject matter in order to be able to make the connections to students' interests and to things that are going on, and to really weave it into their life so that they connect and understand and learn. So that's really what component 1 is all about. It's evidencing this core proposition 2.
Great, thanks so much, Colleen. So it seems like, no, we didn't. We have a couple of other resources we want to share with you. We're not going to share the videos live. They are hyperlinked in the note catcher. One is an overview of component 1, and another one is a deep dive webinar hosted by the Kentucky Network on component 1 a couple of years ago that Colleen had a chance to preview and thought it was really helpful. So we wanted to embed those so you have additional resources.
So just so you know, Lisa, the deeper dive in the Kentucky one, if you use the one that we linked, is just the information from their hour and 10-minute webinar about the selected response. So I pulled out the 15 to 20 minutes around selected response. The whole webinar is available on YouTube, and we can also provide that link as well.
Great, thanks so much for that clarification, Colleen. We will definitely make sure that the longer webinar is also available. So component 1, this was the slide I went back looking for when I was going back and forth. I thought it came a little earlier. So component 1 is our content knowledge component. And thanks again, Colleen, for grounding us in core prop 2. It is a computer-based assessment that measures developmentally appropriate content, knowledge, and pedagogical practices in your chosen certificate area. There are 2 types of questions. The first are the selected response items. I saw somebody asking a question in the Q&A and used MC as the abbreviation for multiple choice. So this, we call them selected response items. These are the multiple choice questions. There are 45 of them, and you have 60 minutes for that. There are also 3 constructed response items and 30 minutes to complete each of those. Next week, Colleen and I are going to do a deep dive into the constructed response exercises, so stay tuned for that one. In terms of how component 1 is weighted, it is worth 40% of your overall national board score. The selected response items that we're going to talk about tonight are 20% and the remaining 20% are the constructed response items. So a couple of resources we just wanted to call your attention to in terms of official guidance and national board documents. The first is the component 1 content knowledge assessment center policies and guidelines. So if you're looking for questions, if you've got questions about, information about accommodations or, what to expect the day of the of your assessment, this is the sort of general overview document that will have that kind of information, and the table of contents is shared here. Then you also have your content-specific instructions, and those are available on that page that's hyperlinked here and also in the note catcher. And you'll see the layout of that. It provides an overview of the component 1 for your certificate area, and then has 2 sections, a section on the selected response items, and then one on the constructed response exercises. And then here's a snapshot or a screenshot of what you'll see there. It will include some sample questions, the standards that are highlighted for your selected response items, and then also an answer key for the sample questions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over. Yeah, Colleen?
Oh, sorry, Lisa. So one of the things you need to understand is that your selected response items will cover your entire range of your certificate, developmentally and pedagogically. So developmentally and with content. So that means that if you are, and we'll talk about this a little bit later when we talk about preparation, but if you are a kindergarten teacher and all of your experience is in kindergarten and you are an early childhood generalist, you're going to need to do some thinking and studying and preparation around grades 1, 2, and 3, because your certificate area can go up to 3rd grade. So that's what we mean when we say it covers the entire range of the certificate. So as we said before, the selected response items are multiple choice questions. There's always 4 answer choices. There is a clock in the corner of your computer screen that will allow you to pace yourself. You can, and I believe we may get to this later, there are ways for you to flag questions and go back to those questions. There's also the prompt number in the corner. So it'll tell you if you're on question 1 out of 45 or question 12 out of 45. And I will say that they recommend that you answer each question, even if you flag it and decide to go back to it, because it's better to have it answered in the event that you run out of time or don't get back to all of the questions that you flagged. You move through on the screen with a navigator button. Like I said, you can flag questions. You are not allowed to bring a scientific calculator in. So you're provided with that for math and science exams. It's available on the screen. Okay, so the component 1 assessment schematic gives you an introduction to the areas that are tested. And we're going to really look at that in just a minute. And it also gives you some sample selected response items, so you can kind of see how they frame things. And they also, the nice thing is they give you the answers, so you can take the test questions and then check yourself. Remember that as you're answering these multiple choice questions, you are doing it through the lens of your national board standards that are called out in the schematic. So we'll talk about that in a minute. So this is the schematic, and this is a screenshot from the component 1 directions for social studies. So you'll see that they actually tell you what standards and content are going to be addressed. So if you look at integrating content for social studies, they're looking at instructional strategies and resources, which is all standard 4. And then the knowing content for history, which includes, you know, history, world history, and US history, and then knowing content like economics, geography, and civics and government, those are all standard 3 of the National Board Standards. So on the right of your schematic, they also give you a rough percentage of how much of the test is going to be, how much of the SRIs are going to be around each of those. And so in this case, 25% is going to be around integrating content in standard 4. And your knowledge of content is actually going to be 75%, or 30 of the 45 questions. So the reason it's important you pay attention to that is that I'm going to want to study, really read and reread standard 3, because standard 3 covers 75% of the lens that I need to be looking through at the content. And then as I'm looking through those things, I'm going to say, wow, I'm a US history teacher. I know my US history down and out, but I better brush up on some of my world history that I might not have been teaching so much of, because a number of the questions, if there's 3 bullet points and there's 17 questions, 4 or 5 of those questions could be on any of those bullet points. So just be aware of that as you kind of do the math. So one of the things that you're going to want to do, and you'll have a graphic organizer. We did graphic organizers for each of these. And so you're going to actually want to, if you've printed out your standards, you're going to want to tab the standards that are being called out for component 1, just like you did for the other components. If you did 2, 3, or 4 yet, you tab those, and so you could turn to them, you'd read them, you'd go back over them. You're going to want to do the same. In addition, in the graphic organizer that we've given you, or Lisa will share with you, we've also hyperlinked the individual standards for your certificate area. So if you click on standard 1, it will give you a PDF of just standard 1. So it'll also be available electronically as well as your hard copy. So let's take a minute, take a deep breath, everybody, on this evening, and think about which of the standards being addressed as you look at your schematic after this webinar. Think about which of them were you going to find the most challenging, and what barriers might exist for you to address that standard. Thinking about the challenge, or what you're going to find challenging or a barrier, what might you do to overcome it? And I guess my big question for you on that one is, who or what might be your resources? So we all have allies. We all have Robins to our Batman. And so who or what might you need, and how might you access those resources? And Lisa, I'm going to punt it back to you.
Thank you, my friend. I saw a question go by that I can imagine many of you are asking, which is, where do you find that schematic for your particular certificate area? So earlier I showed the screenshot of the component-specific instructions for your certificate area. And there's a section for the selected response. And in that selected response, you will see the schematic for your particular certificate area. But as Colleen and I were thinking about what kinds of resources might be helpful and supports might be helpful, specifically around the selected response items for component 1, we thought that it might be helpful to kind of start pulling everything together. So there is a folder, I think I called it SRI graphic organizers, but it is in that list of component 1 resources in the note catcher. And if you open that up, you will see a graphic organizer that looks like this for each certificate area, and you can just find your own. These documents are not a forced copy, they're view only, so you'll just download it and have access to that resource. But we didn't do these as forced copy for a reason. This is the first component 1 webinar that we've ever done. And we all know that, we can plan and design learning opportunities, and we'll reflect on those and have new ideas. And we wanted this to be a live document so we could continue to update that for you if we come across new resources. So I just want to give you an orientation to this graphic organizer, how it's laid out, and what to expect in there. And there's been an update to these graphic organizers since I did the screenshot earlier today, which I'll clarify. So in the first column, you'll see the standards. If this is your first component, one of the important things to know about each of the components is they are anchored in the National Board Standards for your certificate area. However, each component focuses on specific standards and not all of them. That is also true of component 1. So what we've done in the first column is copied over the schematic, which includes the standards from your particular certificate area that are being highlighted in the selected response. Then we have the percentage that Colleen showed on an earlier slide, and then have done an approximation on the number of questions for that particular part of that particular standard, because I know that for me, it's easier to think, oh, this is 20 questions rather than this is 50%. Then what we would encourage you to do, before I move on, you'll see that there's a hyperlink in that first column. And when I was saying that there's been an upgrade to this graphic organizer this afternoon, you will probably see hyperlinks all the way through your standards. What we've done, what Colleen did, was to pull out the specific standard from your standards for the PDF. So you have that as a standalone. So it may be a page or two, some of them may be 4 or 5. So it just really, our hope is that we'll help concentrate that reading and reflection on that. So you'll see that those are hyperlinked. And then what we would encourage you to do is then to read those standards and take notes. One of the missteps or the missteps that folks sometimes take with component 1 is I am a very anxious test taker. And so the first thing that I know I did when I was taking my version of component 1 was I started to think about all that I didn't know and started scrambling to get resources to start studying. But what I lost was the connection to the National Board Standards, that first you're starting with your National Board Standards. So Colleen showed that tabbing activity where you could read and take some notes and do some reflection. You could also use this graphic organizer as a way to capture notes. What are the pedagogical practices or the content knowledge that are raised in those particular standards, and take some notes? And then engage in a self-assessment. What are your strengths? Where do you think you might need to lean in a little bit more and do some studying? And then what are some resources that you can turn to for that? So rather than starting with the resources, starting with the standards and your assessment, like Colleen said, for me, mine was the opposite, Colleen. I taught world history, and so that I knew, but I really needed to brush up on my U.S. history when I was studying for my assessment center part of my component. But the other thing that we know is that for many of you, you can go across that graphic organizer and still say, what resources are out there for me to do some of the extra reading or refreshing that I need to do. So what we've linked at the bottom of this graphic organizer is really a start of some of the resources that we have heard from NBCTs who have gone through this certificate area on resources that they have found helpful. We will continue to collect that information and to update that. And I'll show you another place where we are housing that information. So one place where you'll be able to get those resources is in that graphic organizer. The second place where we'll be collecting that information or housing that information is in this other Google Doc that should be in the note catcher. And this one just goes certificate area by certificate area, because it occurs to us that if you are pursuing under one of the generalist certificates, but you may want to have access to the other certificate areas. This document is also hyperlinked at the bottom of the previous graphic organizer that I shared. So we hope that, that this resource would be helpful for you as you, excuse me, as you engage in your preparation. The ask I have in return is that you are the content expert of the subject matter and the age groups that you're of the students that you're teaching. If you have a resource that you have come across that you have found helpful in your studying and preparation for component one, or have heard has been recommended to you, please just there's a quick survey. This survey will stay live for at least the rest of this candidate cycle, if not next. Just drop us a message with that resource. It's just pick a certificate area and share the resource so we can continue to share the wealth with everybody else. So Colleen, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, thanks. So there's two things here that you have, but before we go any further, I really have to clarify because this bottled me up for a very long time. So in case there's any confusion out there, I just want to be clear that because we use the word standards, there's more than one set of standards. And so when we refer to the excerpted standards or the standards in the graphic organizers here, those are the national board standards. So those are the standards for your certificate area and your developmental level. You also have standards for your content. So we had in our district for a while, we used the Common Core ELA standards. So if I'm looking at what the content is that I need to really be an expert in, I'm not going to look to the national board standards to tell me that. I'm going to look to my content area standards. So whether it's the science standards or the social studies standards, often a state adopts learning standards for students. So just keep in mind that there is multiple sets of standards that you are going to be overlapping in the course of your study. So there's the national board standard that serves as kind of the lens that you're looking at your content specific standards around whatever it is that you teach. And I hope that was a little bit clarifying. Okay, so the standards we have here. So in each of these graphic organizers, and they're all listed here, When you open it, you're going to see the screenshot that Lisa showed you before. And when you click on the top, it's going to open in a folder. This is for social studies. The whole social studies standard bundle is here, but the specific standards 3 and 4 have been pulled out, and they're hyperlinked to the areas that speak directly to the need for standard 3 or standard 4, just so you understand how they're all organized. Okay. So let's recap in the chat. Do we have that slide? Yep. Okay. What are some of the ways that you think you can prepare for the selected response items for component 1? Recap in the chat. So we'll be looking forward to seeing. So as you're talking about that, I'm just going to say that one of the things that I took from the Kentucky webinar, which I thought was brilliant, was a close friend and colleague, Suzanne Farmer, who was leading that webinar, talked about her experience in Kentucky. She was certified as a pre-K kindergarten teacher, and she was doing early childhood. And so she had to be prepared for up to 3rd grade. And so what she did, which I thought was pretty brilliant, was besides studying and looking at textbooks for those different grade levels, she went to a colleague in each of those grade levels and asked them what the big ideas were for science in 1st grade or 2nd grade or 3rd grade or math or social studies. Then she asked them what their favorite lesson was and what misconceptions they planned for. And so by gathering that information from those colleagues, she was able to really make her knowledge around those grade levels that she did not have experience in become clear. So as she was reading things about development or for 7 and 8-year-olds, all of a sudden it started to make sense and she was able to connect that. All right. Lisa, back to you.
Great, thanks, Colleen. I was getting distracted by some of the questions in the chat, the Q&A, so thanks. So we wanted to share a little bit about assessment logistics. And some of what we're sharing right now is applicable both for the constructed response and for the selected response, but wanted to share some logistics. The question that I imagine, I know is on many of your minds is, when will you receive the authorization to test? And if that is something that's new language for you, I'm going to talk through that right now. So there is a video in the slides and in the note catcher on a former colleague. It's really fun to see this. The person who's in the video here is a former colleague of ours, Mike Lee. But this video has an overview on things to expect and prepare for the assessment center. I'm not intending to play that. So scheduling your appointment. So first, you need to pay your $75, the registration fee, and your component 1 fee, and then you receive an authorization to test. The important thing here is to make sure that your authorization to test matches the name on your government issued ID, because that's what you'll be using to check in at the assessment center. Right now, I don't have a date for you on when to expect the authorization to test. I've reached out to our colleagues who manage the assessment to get that information, and hoping to have greater clarity for you all for next week's webinar. As you can imagine, all of the shifts in dates are due to the flexibility, means that some of these dates have also been shifting, and I promise to get you an answer and bring that to you all next week. Then you'll log on to the Pearson View site and look for the nearest testing center, and then schedule your appointment. If you've had friends who've gone through the process before, you've probably heard that it is wise to schedule your testing date as soon as you can when you receive the authorization, so you get the ideal date and time that work best for you. We are hoping that the flexibility and shifts in dates mean that it might be easier for teachers to do this after the school year, and a particular challenging school year has wrapped up. I do want to talk about some testing accommodations, because this often gets overlooked. If you need some testing accommodations, there are some listed in the request for testing accommodations form and instructions. There are two accommodations that don't often get listed that I want to call out. One is if English is not your primary language, there may be some testing accommodations available for you, as well as testing exceptions or accommodations for nursing mothers. That one in particular is not listed in the document that I mentioned below about requests for testing accommodations, the forms and instructions, but is on the Pearson View site. So that's just something to be mindful of. The other thing that it's important to note is that those accommodations need to be made in advance of your testing date. So those accommodations can be put in place before you arrive.
Okay, thanks, Lisa. So a couple of things that you need to think about. I know that I get a little bit anxious when I'm prepping for a test, so you may want to consider driving and finding the place the day before or before the actual test day. That way you know exactly how to get there. And I don't know how many of you have had a horrible experience with one of the GPS services that we use in our lives, but I can tell you that there have been times when I've been like out in the middle of nowhere and it tells me I've arrived at my destination. And so finding your test site ahead of time can just really reduce some of your stress. Plan to get there early. You know, if there's an accident or, you know, something that a detour that was unexpected, it's just nice to have a few extra minutes and not to be worried. Be well rested, get some rest the night before. You, I'm sure, will have done everything that you can, and you will be as well prepared as you will be. So take some, be kind to yourself and allow yourself to get some rest. My experience in these testing sites is they're cold, and they don't let you wear a coat typically. So you're going to want to dress in layers, and that way you can take off a sweater, put on a sweater if you get warm or cold. Like Lisa said, make sure that your name on your government issued ID is the same as your authorization to test. And you may want to consider bringing something to eat for your break, like a little snack, a protein bar, whatever, so that you give Come on, the brain science says we need to feed our brains in order for us to think well. And between the 60 minutes and the 3 30-minute constructed responses, plus your 10-minute break, you're going to want to definitely fuel back up. Lisa, back to you.
So a little bit on materials that are permitted in the testing center. I'm not going to talk through all of this in word for word because that's a couple of months away, but wanted you to have that in the resources, and also wanted to let you know that that information is on page 11 of the Assessment Center policy and guidelines. But a couple of things to note is the importance of the photo identification that matches the name on your testing authorization, that those two, there's an erasable note board and marker, and what you also see here are some additional minor comfort aids as the language is used here that you're able to bring in. As Colleen mentioned, if you're in a math or science specialty area, a scientific calculator that is online will be provided. And for some certificate areas, there is a response booklet. For most of us, the majority of certificate areas do not have a response booklet, but those that are listed here, the math and music, are exceptions to that. So just something when you get closer to be mindful of in terms of what to expect. I'm going to turn it back to you. We ping-ponged a little bit more at the end there, Colleen, than I had.
That's okay. As I said before, remember that you want to answer the questions, even if you flag them to go back. You're going to want to talk to other people and find out information about your developmental grade levels or things outside of your experience that might be included. I do have a suggestion, somebody in the chat box. Lisa, I also go into the chat box and look at those questions. And so someone asked for clarification around the developmental levels. And there is a great resource that we use in candidate support, actually, as our teachers prepare for component 1. It's a book by Chip Wood called Yardsticks, and it's child and adolescent development ages 4 through 14. And it breaks it down in really nice chunks about what you can expect at each age within the developmental levels. You, as I said before, you want to think about content, you want to think about big ideas. We can go to the next slide. So somebody earlier in the chat asked this. I'm an 8th grade math teacher. Will I be asked to do calculus? That's a great question. Let's look at the schematic, which I believe is on the next slide. So here is the schematic for early adolescent mathematics. And you'll notice that 40% covers trigonometry, discrete mathematics, data analysis, statistics, and calculus. Now, most people are not teaching calculus to 12, 13, or 14-year-olds, but it's still content that you're expected to know. And so if you haven't taken a calculus course since college and you need to refresh yourself on that, then before you panic, I would do the math. There's 4 bullets there. There's approximately 16 questions. So you might face around 4 questions on calculus. You might not. It might be 1 question, it might be 5, but you can anticipate that it's probably not going to be more than 4 questions on that. So you're going to want to review the big ideas. You're going to want to refresh. You're going to want to maybe pull out your college textbook and look back at that. So yes, even though you primarily teach algebra, you are going to need to know all of the material that's listed in the schematic.